Helen Ray Fowler was a historic figure, but it's the kind of notoriety no one would want. She was the only black female put to her end in the state of New York during the 20th century. The terrible case. Helen Ray Fowler was, by any estimation, one tough woman. She stood 5'7" and weighed 227 pounds, according to prison records. At 36, she'd been married several times. At the time of her arrest in 1943, she had 5 children ranging in age from 5 to 20, as well as a grandchild. The crime for which Helen Ray Fowler perished was certainly a squalid one. William Fowler, a gas station owner from nearby Ransomville, had turned up in the Memorial Parkway area of Niagara Falls with 2 checks, a lot of cash, and seemingly not too much common sense. The area was one of the country's most notorious red light districts, and Fowler, who made a small living as a prostitute, was one of its residents. All told, it wasn't the safest place to be taking a few drinks and going from bar to bar flashing a large bankroll. Fowler and cousin Lee Clark did, Fowler paying for it with his life. The 2 checks helped cost Helen Fowler her own. So did her partner George Knight. Knight, a rather undesirable character well known to the police, slaughtered William Fowler and robbed him. He and Helen Fowler then hid his body in a trunk, later borrowing a car to dump his body off the North Grand Island Bridge. Fowler's remains were found in the upper Niagara River sometime later, and in December 1943, the pair were arrested. The owner of the car had informed the police, who took little time to arrest the pair on suspicion. Once in custody, Fowler and Knight would never leave it alive. The pair provided police with statements, each blaming the other for the slaying. Knight claimed Fowler urged him to destroy the victim, while Fowler blamed Knight entirely, claiming that she took no role in the slaying itself and had begged Knight to stop. Unfortunately for both of them, they'd given statements before asking for a lawyer, so none were present when the statements were given or during their initial interrogations. Today, courtesy of the Miranda case guaranteeing detainees to be read their rights and offered legal assistance, this wouldn't be tolerated. In 1944, it was perfectly normal. A grand jury found both defendants had a case to answer. The charge was first-degree slaying for the purpose of robbery. The penalty was capital punishment. If the jury found them both guilty and didn't recommend mercy, then only the courts or the governor could save them. New York law was also explicit about individual slayings committed by more than one person. The felony slaying rule was clear. If Fowler and Knight had both robbed William Fowler, then they were equally responsible for his passing, and both could lose their own lives for it. Public feeling was against the defendants as well. They were seen as disreputable characters who also happened to be African Americans. Their alleged victim, on the other hand, was a respectable, hard-working man just out for a little fun after work. He also happened to be white. New York didn't use its capital punishment against African Americans as freely as other states, those in the Deep South, for instance. Nor was it as overtly racist about it as, say, Alabama or Mississippi. Of New York's 695 electrocutions, 146 were African Americans, but the racial issue did nothing to steer Knight and Fowler away from the electric chair. Fowler's lawyer didn't exactly help matters. A respected local lawyer and later a state senator, Earl Bridges had been appointed by the court to defend her, something he did with seemingly little enthusiasm and even less effect. Against District Attorney Marsh's 17 witnesses, Bridges only produced 2. Marsh could produce no weapon or establish precisely why William Fowler was in Knight's home when he passed away. Had he followed her there, a few doors down from the dive bar he'd met her in? Had she invited him there as a friendly gesture or to do business? Marsh never provided a clear explanation of why the victim was at the scene or if he really had been lured there to be robbed and annihilated. Bridges failed to take advantage of that. Marsh's star witness Genevieve Persons, who was also Fowler's daughter, later recanted her eyewitness testimony that her mother had been actively involved in the slaying. She admitted that she had made a deal after being caught trying to cash the 2 checks William Fowler had been carrying when he perished, and had exchanged testimony for being left out of the case. Bridges could have taken better advantage of that. He didn't. Bridges' witnesses consisted only of Fowler's daughter Judy, aged only 15, and son George, aged only 9. George was too young even to be sworn in. They both claimed Knight was entirely responsible for the slaying, June corroborating her mother's claim that she'd begged Knight to stop, and had only helped hide the body, not commit the slaying. Bridges could have pressed that issue harder, along with Knight's having recanted his initial statement. Knight's later statement that he had committed the crime alone and Fowler had only helped hide the body might still have saved her, but it was not used in the trial. Worst of all was Bridges' closing statement before the jury retired. It is hard to make a case for Helen Fowler. She is guilty of any number of crimes. She has been handed from man to man, has had children by them all. She has lied, she has cheated, and she has sold herself. Perhaps it would be better for her children if she were put out of the way. Bridges' remarks were almost the last thing the jury heard before Judge William Munson sent them to consider their verdict. If they voted to convict without recommending mercy, Fowler and Knight would very likely meet their end. Bridges' final remarks virtually invited them to do so. After asking Munson to clarify the felony slaying rule on convicting more than one defendant for the same slaying, Munson told them they could. It wasn't long before they reached a verdict on both defendants. Guilty as charged. No recommendation for mercy. Days later, Judge Munson passed the sentence. On 19 February 1944, he sentenced them both to their end. The day before her end. On 21 February, the pair arrived at Sing Sing's End House, the purpose-built block reserved solely for the condemned. They had come to meet their end, and after 2 delays, their date was set. 16 November 1944 would see them become Sing Sing's 19th and 20th capital punishments for that year. The court denied their appeals without comment. Neither ordered the traditional last meal, something Sing Sing was always very generous about. What the condemned wanted they usually got. Knight and Fowler got nothing. Their appetites had probably perished before they did. According to tradition, the most emotional prisoner, Fowler, would go first. It was a long-established rule that when punishing more than one prisoner, the most upset were deemed most likely to pose a problem. Sobbing uncontrollably even before her final walk, Fowler continued sobbing even after she was strapped down just after 11 p.m. Minutes later, she was gone. Before she left this world on the night of November 16, 1944, Helen wrote, "It's a mother's love and it's been so much disgrace, but this is the truth of why I am here. Please, I'll live for God from now on if spared, for when children try to have their life taken just to be free, it's a shame." A few minutes after she was unstrapped and wheeled away for her autopsy, George Knight entered the chamber. Calm to the end, he allowed himself to be seated and strapped before asking to speak. It was the last thing he ever said. "Can I talk? I want to thank you all for being so nice to me." The switch was thrown. Minutes later, Knight too was wheeled away. Staff and witnesses, so few that Warden Snyder had to round up enough to make the affair legal, filed out in silence. The press barely noticed the event, let alone reported it much, after Helen Fowler's passing. In the normal run of things, Helen Fowler's date with the Reaper should have made a media event, at least in the Empire States itself. Very few women ever sat in New York's electric chair, and Fowler was the only African-American woman punished in such a way by New York State in the 20th century. Both of those factors should have seen her become front-page news like her predecessors, but she didn't. Some of her better-known predecessors, like Ruth Snyder, who passed in 1928, Anna Antonio 1934, and Eva Koo 1935, received pages of coverage. Even Martha Place, punished in 1899, and the first woman ever to be electrocuted, is better remembered than Helen Fowler. Those who came after her, Martha Beck in 1951, and especially Ethel Rosenberg in 1953, were celebrities long before the switch was thrown. Until the case of Furman versus Georgia in 1972, in fact, Sing Sing was responsible for almost one-third of all America's female capital punishments. Fowler's case was different. Local papers reported her trial, but her punishment went almost unreported. When she perished on 16 November 1944, there was virtually no press coverage. Sing Sing's warden, William Snyder, had to make a special effort to round up enough witnesses to make the punishment legal under state law. It was seen by many as a grubby, squalid crime committed by grubby, squalid people. Of New York's 695 electrocutions, 146 were African Americans, but the racial issue did nothing to steer Knight and Fowler away from the electric chair. Fowler's lawyer didn't exactly help matters. A respected local lawyer and later a state senator, Earl Bridges had been appointed by the court to defend her, something he did with seemingly little enthusiasm and even less effect. Against District Attorney Marsh's 17 witnesses, Bridges only produced 2. Marsh could produce no weapon or establish precisely why William Fowler was in Knight's home when he passed away. Had he followed her there, a few doors down from the dive bar he'd met her in? Had she invited him there as a friendly gesture or to do business? Marsh never provided a clear explanation of why the victim was at the scene or if he really had been lured there to be robbed and annihilated. Bridges failed to take advantage of that. Marsh's star witness Genevieve Persons, who was also Fowler's daughter, later recanted her eyewitness testimony that her mother had been actively involved in the slaying. She admitted that she had made a deal after being caught trying to cash the 2 checks William Fowler had been carrying when he perished, and had exchanged testimony for being left out of the case. Bridges could have taken better advantage of that. He didn't. Bridges' witnesses consisted only of Fowler's daughter Judy, aged only 15, and son George, aged only 9. George was too young even to be sworn in. With the war still raging and thousands dying every day, few had much interest in just another double capital punishment at Sing Sing. They were common enough already. The reason for public disinterest was a simple one. Not surprisingly, war news dominated the newspapers in 1944. The battleship Tirpitz, Hitler's last major naval unit, had been destroyed by the Royal Air Force on 12 November, only days before Fowler and Knight met their own fate. Despite meriting at least a footnote in the state's history, Helen Ray Fowler perished almost unnoticed. With Fowler and Knight safely in their graves, they were swiftly forgotten. A month later, the Battle of the Bulge dominated the headlines. So too did Governor Dewey's failed run for president. Bridges, though, had rather better luck politically speaking. A Republican, Bridges served on the Board of Education and was elected to the state Senate in 1949. That's all for today's video. See you all next time.